This is Market Pulse by Faster Forward, a podcast from Northern Trust Asset Servicing, where experts share their insights on current trends in the markets and financial landscape. My name's Grant Johnsey, and I'm head of Client Solutions, Banking and Markets Americas at Northern Trust. And I'm delighted today to speak with an old friend of mine, Chris Jackson. Chris is head of public polling at Ipsos, and he's coming to visit us from Washington, D.C. today. I've known Chris for a long time, and I've always enjoyed hearing his perspectives. Ipsos is a global research and consulting firm with offices in over 90 countries worldwide, and they provide both public and private research. They specialize in public opinion, consumer insights, brand awareness, and social trends. We've got a lot to cover today. Chris oversees all of Ipsos research intended for publication, and I'll be asking him about their key findings. Doing so today means inevitably we're going to be discussing some politically charged topics. So I'd like to remind our viewers and listeners that our goal is to really understand the trends and the drivers that we see today. We'll seek to remain impartial throughout and focus on the Ipsos findings to help us better understand the forces at play in shaping today's markets. Chris, welcome to Chicago. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be with you, man.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background? How did you get into this unique role?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad with you a long time ago and ended up working in politics in Washington, and actually sort of fell backwards into a job at a polling firm and discovered that I absolutely loved the work, because essentially it's all about asking questions and finding answers, and it really scratches that itch of like wanting to know things, wanting to learn things, which has sort of been my defining characteristic of my whole life. So I've been doing it now for about 2.5 decades.
That's pretty amazing. I love reading your stuff, and we always have great debates and discussions on the side too. But here's what I'm really curious: like, how does Ipsos decide what to research? How do you work with? Because you work with both private organizations and you do your own research. How do you decide what to research? How does that work at Ipsos?
Yeah, so it's a huge company and it's a huge remit. We're doing dozens of surveys every given week, and a lot of it's driven by client needs. So we work with a lot of clients across a lot of different sectors, and we're helping them solve problems, right? If a client wants to bring a new product to market and they're trying to find who their audience is going to be, we help them do that research. If another client is looking to understand how to deal with some public policy issue, message development, we help that. And then in my space, I primarily work with news organizations who are looking to understand how the American public is responding to events of the day. So the conversations are really very organic, very back and forth with these reporters and editors. It's sort of like, well, this is a thing that's happening. How are people responding? How do we ask questions to get at that? And we sort of co-create these surveys from that, including the work we do with organizations like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal.
So speaking of the Journal, I know myself and a lot of our viewers are readers of the Journal, and I have to admit I'm a closet fan of the lifestyle section.
That's right.
And every now and then I see Ipsos featured in some of the articles on, I remember one on men's fashion, and I read those because I need all the help I can get. How does Ipsos interact with Wall Street Journal? Like, how do those studies that, or things like even fashion come about?
That's right. So we know a lot of people. I know a lot of people in the newsroom there, have connections in different parts. And despite the fact that most of the time when you see public polling, it's elections, it's sort of all the stuff that makes us all a little bit depressed. But we like to do things that are kind of lighthearted and fun too. So a year or two ago, one of these editors who worked sort of in that lifestyle section was like, hey, do you think we could do something where we actually measure what men's fashion trends are like popping right now and not? And it's like, absolutely we can. That's a great idea. That's such a nice breath of fresh air with all the politics stuff that we normally do. So we jumped on it. We did it, put that together with them. It was a lot of fun.
So how do you go about researching this? I mean, how do you construct a sample audience for polling, whether it's something fun like men's fashion or something heavier like some of the political trends? How do you approximate a representative slice? How do you approach this when you get hired for these assignments?
Market and public opinion research is very much at a bit of a transition point where the methods of the past, using the telephone, calling people at their home on a landline, just doesn't work anymore. And that was the gold standard for a couple of decades. For a while, there was a bit of a transition period where we could still use cell phones and still reach people, but even that is increasingly difficult. So now it's a very mixed environment where people are doing lots of different things. And what we found, the most robust method to reach people is actually the oldest, using mail surveys, literally mailing stuff to people's houses and getting them to respond. The problem with that, of course, is it's very slow because it's the mail. and it takes time for people to fill out the paper form and mail it back. So what we do at Ipsos for a lot of our research is we've built a panel of people using those mail surveys that then agree to take surveys for us online, so that we can go back to them much more quickly to do follow-up surveys. And that's what we use to do most of our research, including, for instance, work that we do for the Fed, the Federal Reserve.
How do you ask the questions on a research questionnaire then to not be politically charged or to lead the respondent down one path or the other? How do you keep them neutral to really get at the heart of the sentiment?
I mean, that is a big part of what my job is to have an understanding of how the words I choose to put into a questionnaire might be interpreted, might be misconstrued even. But that's also why we like to have multiple people look at something, bring a diversity of viewpoints in to sort of look at it, because that's one of those places where having people from different backgrounds actually does help make sure you're not inadvertently saying something that will set someone off. Because ultimately what we're about is trying to get as clean a measure of public opinion as possible. If what we are actually doing is we're measuring public opinion for 80% of people, but for 28% of people they're flying off the handle because of some word we chose to use, the measure's not as good. It's the data point, the statistic is just not as useful as it would be otherwise. And that is a constant struggle in research to balance that. And in fact, you actually do see in a lot of polling that's released, particularly by political campaigns, they're intentionally using loaded language because they're trying to push their side of the agenda. So if you ever see a political campaign release their polling results, you always got to be a little skeptical. Make sure to read the question carefully, because a lot of times they are intentionally leading a question in a certain direction. And that's something that you can do, and that you have to be very careful not to if you're trying to do good research.
So they'll elicit a specific answer based upon the way the question's framed.
That's right, yeah. So like, for instance, a number of different topics, the way you frame the question, the way you set the question up, you can get a pretty wide range of different opinions on it based on sort of the information you provide, the words you choose. So if like immigration, for instance, hot button topic right now, depending on how you ask about immigration, you can get a majority of Americans in favor of immigration to a majority of Americans opposed to immigration based on sort of what context and additional information you put into that.
Interesting. So let's dive in. There's a lot to unpack here. Your research is fascinating, and you cover a lot of different topics that are very relevant in today's environment. Can you just briefly describe the confluence of trends that you're focused in right now?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of big picture trends, and I think they're probably things that your listeners are pretty aware of. Of course, there's the huge social demographic trends that are happening, the getting older America, more diverse population, all of those sort of things that are happening that are sort of almost a background, almost like gravity, right? The other sort of two major trends that we see that are really important is this long-term decline in trust or confidence in institutions. And it's not something that we see just in the United States. It's really happening around the developed world, where people just don't trust governments. They don't trust sort of major institutions. And it's really started in the 1970s and has been playing through to today. There's just been this long-term decline, and that drives a lot of these sort of populist movements we've seen emerging around the world in politics, of these anti-system, anti-establishment candidates who run very effective campaigns. Donald Trump was essentially one of those in 2016, and again sort of in 2024. Bernie Sanders on the left is very much the same type of candidate, even though vastly different messaging, of course. But they're both running against this sort of view that the system is broken, which is a widespread belief. Most Americans, about 2/3 of Americans, believe that the economic system is broken or rigged against them. And then the third trend that I think is really important and is probably a little understated in most people's understanding is just how fragmented and fractured the information landscape is right now. If people like us who read newspapers are the decided minority of Americans today. In fact, if you look at the long-term trend, in the 1980s, 3/4 of Americans read a newspaper every day, and that's dropped down to single digits.
Wow.
Who read the newspaper every day. And instead, people are going to all sorts of different places to get news and information: social media, online, digital news. just their friends and family, all sorts of different things. And what that does is it creates essentially different realities and different understandings of realities for different slices of the population. And there's no single way anymore to reach even a plurality of Americans. Because if you look at traditional news, so like the networks, the national newspapers, NPR, PBS, all those kind of things, that's only about a third of Americans who still get most of their news from those sources. The other 2/3, it's the Wild West, all sorts of different sources, all sorts of different places. So it's a very fragmented, fractured environment. And that's driving, again, a lot of this populist and sort of anti-establishment fervent that we're seeing right now is this sort of very small, different microcosms of the population with their own realities.
Can you break down that other two? So 1/3 today is getting their news from traditional news outlets,
That's
right? How's the other 2/3 break down? Are they all using, a variety of sources, or how does that?
I mean,
break
everyone
down?
uses a variety of sources, but we're sort of looking at what the main or the majority of where they get their information from. Of that other 2/3, about 10%, 12% are using conservative media, so Fox, Breitbart, OANN, all those sort of places, Daily Wire. Another 12, 15% are still using sort of more local news outlets, which used to be the majority and has declined significantly as local news has really been hollowed out. Online news, so this is sort of like aggregators, Yahoo News, Google News, Apple News, these kind of things, which are mostly sourcing from other places, but the people reading it oftentimes don't necessarily know that. And then about a little over a third of Americans are getting most of their news either from social media or their friends and family or from nothing. And that's sort of, again, that's the plurality place right now, is that group of people who really have no formal source of information, instead of sort of putting together their view of reality from this very mixed and noisy environment.
What about the impact from these different news sources and how how Americans in particular were consuming news? How did that play out in the most recent presidential election last year?
Huge impacts. And in fact, I think this is probably, in terms of politics, the biggest sort of division between the country. And we've seen in the last couple of elections that essentially people who still use the mainstream news sources, traditional news sources, generally vote Democratic. Partially there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario where, conservatives have sort of fled from liberal news to conservative media, but there's still very much, even if you control for things like partisanship, where Republicans who use traditional news sources still more likely to vote Democratic than not. So Harris won that group of people relatively decisively. And then Trump essentially won everyone else. He won, of course, conservative media viewers by a huge margin, but he won social media viewers and no news consumers, again, by large margins. And that's really the difference, is Republicans and Donald Trump particularly have been very effective at reaching these groups of people who do not consume information through sort of normal channels. And that has upended sort of how American politics works.
That's interesting. So I guess given all these diverging channels of communication and news, how should corporations and organizations evolve in their messaging? What types of things is Ipsos seeing there in terms of how can an organization try to be effective in communicating without, perhaps stepping on a political landmine?
I think the first thing is you have to have a really good understanding of who your stakeholders are and where they're coming from. Because the truth is, you cannot please everyone. You're going to probably irritate someone at some point. You just have to make sure that the people that you're irritating are not necessarily your customers or your stakeholders. So understanding who your people are is, I think, the very first thing that every organization should do. And I think you should do it, and this is a thing a lot of companies are resistant to, but you should look at your consumers from a political standpoint. Like, are your buyers, are your customers Republicans or Democrats? Are they liberal or conservative? And a lot of organizations are resistant to that. They think it involves them in politics, but I think it is, again, sort of base stakes of understanding where your risks are, because a lot of the risks are coming from these sort of political consumer activism trajectories.
That makes sense.
So I think that's the first one. Then I think the second point that's always important to keep in mind is that because of this fragmenting of the American information landscape, the meaning of words have actually started to change, where some groups ascribe certain meanings to words that other groups don't. And you've seen this happen in a lot of things that a couple of years ago you might have thought are relatively innocuous. So the word freedom, right? Describes a property, right? Freedom, but freedom in particularly a public context is increasingly sort of loaded as conservative or Trump aligned or anything Republican sort of seeming. So if you see someone talking about freedom publicly, it's coded in that sort of language. People sort of interpret it that way. You see it on the other side with diversity, which again, a couple of years ago was just a descriptor. Diversity is like, you have more than one thing. It's diverse. But now increasingly, if you just say the word diversity, it has a certain coding, meaning people sort of impute your motivation around it. So we're seeing that across a lot of different domains with a lot of different language. And it's very important, particularly if you're someone who's a communicator, to understand where your people are, where your stakeholders are, and then how are they interpreting what you're saying. Not what you think you're saying, but how they're hearing it, because they're not always the same things.
That's really interesting. So even if I said I have a diversity of options or freedom to choose from my solutions, those words might actually deliver a politically charged impact that I'm not intending.
Exactly, yeah. People might take from what you're saying something other than you're intending to say, because again, this larger environment and context and how people are sort of driving meaning into things that may not have existed a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's definitely a challenge to avoid. So continuing down that path, though, I'm really curious. So today we're recording this on April 1st. There's obviously some news coming out tomorrow from the Trump administration on April 2nd. Not knowing what that is, we're approaching 100 days in to the Trump administration. What types of sentiment changes is Ipsos detecting at this point coming from U.S. politics in the new administration? Are you starting to see any change in tide or change in sentiment?
So Trump came back into office with muted but positive approval ratings, which is pretty normal for a new president. They come into office and they generally get a boost of popularity, referred to as a honeymoon a lot of times.
Makes sense.
That started to come down relatively quickly. It's still, his approval rating still not overwhelmingly positive, certainly more positive than it was in his first administration. And what we're seeing with the American public is a lot of apprehension, but not necessarily a lot of clarity. And I think that isn't surprising if you sort of consider the last 2 months and all the things that have happened, that it's sort of hard to keep track of. And for people whose job it is to keep track of it, it's hard to keep track of. For a regular person who has a life, it's even more overwhelming. So we see a lot of apprehension, a lot of concern, but that's not yet necessarily fully translated into any sort of different behaviors, right? We haven't seen American consumers, for instance, pulling back. We certainly haven't seen any sort of widespread, protests like we saw in 2017 after Trump's first election. So Americans do still seem to be in this sort of trying to figure out what's next moment, but there is certainly a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern. And I think that puts us in a potentially delicate moment, because if something real does happen, like tomorrow and, the threatened tariffs that the administration has been talking about, and that does in fact have an impact on cost, which has been the main concern for Americans, we might see a relatively quick shift in consumer opinion, because they're sort of already primed to jump. And they're just trying to figure out which way to go.
And I remember, when we were chatting, kind of preparing for this, and you were sharing some of the research, one of the areas that you mentioned that Trump really won the election, a key issue, was on price and inflation and what happened. Can you talk a little bit about that? What the Ipsos findings found from the polls? Yeah.
So when we asked Americans all through last year what the main issue was, and it was always cost of living, prices, inflation. That's what Americans were saying they were most worried about. And Trump campaigned on that to a large extent. A lot of the campaign focused on sort of the more outrageous parts of it, and then of course the Democratic rhetoric about democracy was often front and center. But Trump's campaign was very disciplined about hitting on sort of cost issues, cost of living issues, tying that to Harris and Biden, and then his own proposals, for instance, exempting tipped wages from taxation, things like that sort of speak to that in a relatively straightforward way. Even tariffs were read at the time essentially as sort of a way to support American workers. Americans don't necessarily fully understand how tariffs work. though they're increasingly are starting to understand. So it was the election was fundamentally about costs of living, inflation, and Harris essentially lost because people were still irritated about costs, and Trump won because he promised to return the country to 2019 prices.
So how, any insights? I mean, Trump tariffs is just constantly in the news every day and will be for the foreseeable future. How is the U.S. audience responding to tariffs right now from your findings?
So we're seeing Americans are increasingly negative about the idea of tariffs, particularly negative about the idea of tariffs against Mexico and Canada. More supportive, for instance, like tariffs against China, for instance.
That makes sense.
But only a third of Americans support tariffs against our neighbors. And what we're seeing is, again, like I mentioned a minute ago, Trump's approval rating has remained relatively solid. Before the election, his approval and handling of the economy was one of his strongest characteristics, right? That was essentially one of his strengths. And that's dropped to now be one of his weakest. And that's, I think, a warning sign for the administration, because that's also what we saw with Joe Biden back in 2021. He was elected to end the pandemic. And for a little while, we thought he had, but then the Delta wave happened in mid 2021. A bunch of people decided that, the pandemic isn't over. And that's when Joe Biden's approval ratings collapsed. He did not deliver on the thing he was elected for. So that's really Trump's risk right now, is they're doing all of this other stuff about the government and Doge and everything else. It's not really what people voted for. People voted for 2019 prices. And if he doesn't deliver on that, if indeed he goes the other direction, makes things more expensive, that really risks a rupture with his with the American public and a real damage potentially to the popularity of his government and their ability to hold on to control of Congress.
So for the Trump second administration, your view is that it's really going to, his popularity will hinge on how he delivers on tackling inflation.
I think so. And inflation is one of these things that does actually cut through all of the media bubbles, because everyone's still paying for gas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is a certain reality of the gas pump that is not as easily filtered by if you're getting your news on. It's inescapable, exactly, where you get your news from. So and that's why it was so damaging for Biden, and that's potentially the risk for Trump.
Interesting. So consumer confidence is another area that you monitor. And what's really interesting about Ipsos, and one of the reasons I was excited to have you, is because you've got offices all over the world. You get a lot of good local insight. And it's interesting looking at some of the trends right now. So in looking at the Ipsos consumer confidence right now, it looks like the trend is generally going down in Latin America, with Argentina obviously being one exception, where it's kind of mixed in Asia. Any sense on what the drivers are there globally?
Yeah, so Ipsos runs a monthly consumer confidence study in 31 countries. It was actually my very first project when I joined the company like 20 years ago, was running the U.S. version of this study. So it's something I'm very close to still. And I think we see a lot of different factors, a lot of idiosyncratic factors driving consumer sentiment. Now, of course, the big picture driver has been inflation, cost of living. That has started to subside around the world in the last 9-12 months or so. Earlier here than it did in other countries. So it's actually other countries were sort of slower to sort of see that bounce back. But we are still seeing a lot of friction. I think for Latin America, for instance, there is actually a lot of concern about what's happening here is actually driving a lot of the response, that the actions of the administration are having knock-on effects all around the Western Hemisphere and even into Europe to some extent. And in Asia, a little less so. Asia, of course, is increasingly sort of centered around China. So what's happening here matters a little less there. So that's much more idiosyncratic into what's driving their sentiment.
Interesting. Consumer trends is another thing that you follow a lot. Any broad consumer trends so far in 2025?
Consumers are a little bit all over the place right now, because there's this sort of interesting sort of push-pull of there's a lot of spending happening of people trying to enjoy some of the sort of post-pandemic glow. There's some data to suggest people are trying to buy things in advance of tariffs going into place, though, again, that's sort of small. But there's also, again, the apprehension I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of people also sort of preparing to sort of buckle down, not necessarily spend as much, a lot of potential concern about, shifting purchasing from brand names to generic categories. So it's a very sort of mixed marketplace. And I think, again, that's that anxiety that the American consumers have, where they're still sort of waiting to decide which way they need to jump. And it could go potentially either way, depending on what happens in the wider world.
One more question on this topic. You alluded earlier around how in the second Trump administration, there's less activism, less consumer boycotting. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why is that?
Yeah, so we've asked Americans over the last couple of weeks, and we're seeing, 25% of Americans saying that they're engaging in some sort of politically motivated consumer behavior, stopping buying a particular company or brand because of their political stance, starting to buy from a particular brand.
And can I ask, how is that compared to relative past 20?
It's
25?
lower than we saw, for instance, in 2017, 2018, when there was a much larger sort of groundswell of movement. And I don't think anyone has a single clear explanation of what is driving that. I mean, I think partially, of course, if you're a Republican, you're happy. You're not engaging in that kind of stuff because your side won. If you're a Democrat, it does seem like there's a certain amount of demoralization that has happened on the left, but there's also, it seems like, a bit of a vacuum of a clear direction for Democrats that was filled in 2017. Again, if you can remember back then, there's the big protests that were organized. People sort of had a thing to sort of follow. It just doesn't seem to exist right now. It's a much more chaotic moment for the American left.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a reasonable theory. Tell me, Chris, before we wrap up here, what research are you conducting now that we should be on the lookout for in the coming weeks and months?
Well, again, at Ipsos, we do a lot of stuff. We're constantly publishing new polling. I'll actually have some polling out tomorrow on Signalgate, if you can remember that from last week. Feels like a million years ago. But we actually have a piece of research that we should be publishing next week that I'm really interested to see. Haven't even seen the data yet. But with that global consumer sentiment study, we added a question asking about views of countries around the world. So we asked people in, again, these 31 markets, how they feel about the United States, about Great Britain, about Russia, about China. And it's a repeat of a question we actually asked last October. So we're going to be able to see from 6 months ago to now, how has that changed? And it'll give us a little bit of a sense of what the administration's impact on sort of America's standing in the world might be. I think it'll be really interesting. It'll be part of our Global Advisor publication, most likely next week.
And how do we get your access to your research? How do people engage with Ipsos?
So everything I do is public. You'll find it on our website, ipsos.com. You'll also oftentimes see it in the newspaper. I'm also certainly available if anyone ever has any questions. I'm certainly happy for people to reach out to me directly.
Chris, this was fantastic. I really appreciate you making the trip from Washington, D.C. Thanks for your time and willingness to meet with us today. And thank you to our listeners today for joining. I look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Market Pulse.